My grandma was the light of my life. She was the most humble, kind, and spiritual woman I've ever known. She was a healer, not by choice, but by necessity. She had 18 children, and her and my papa, they sharecropped. They had little to nothing, and they lived a very hard life out in a rural area. And I used to love to listen to her stories about her younger days. Now, I just now told you in the previous video about this vicious spell that I just never seen anything like it involving consuming a spell. Well, I have another one for you that involves my grandma. This happened a few days before my grandma and my pawpaw was getting married. Now, in those days, weddings and funerals were held in the home, basically in what we call today the living room. For many rural Black communities, this was the practice. There were no white wedding dresses, tuxedos, decorations, none of that. People just wore their nicest Sunday clothes. They have a little bit of food to eat, and they just enjoyed one another. All of this took place on the site of our family's old home place, a big old barn looking house built by my great uncles. Now, my great grandma was helping my grandma get ready for the wedding. Some of my grandma's sisters were also helping. Neighbors and friends, they would drop by the house to visit, wish them well, just give her good luck, and sometimes would leave little presents for her. Well, this one woman, she bought a beautiful piece of white coconut cake for my grandma to enjoy that evening. And my grandma told me it was the biggest, most fluffiest coconut cake she had ever seen. And in those days, cakes was not common. Out in some of the rural areas like we lived in, cakes was not a everyday thing. Most people only made cakes around Christmas or some other very special occasion like a dinner on the ground at the church. Also, they didn't have refrigerators either. They would place their pies and their cakes and other things that they wanted to keep. They would place these in cabinets, and they never did go bad. My grandma used to tell me how my great great grandma, her grandma, would go around visiting her sons and daughters' homes, and she would make a cake a month in advance and store it in her traveling trunk and share it with family when she got there. But these were not cakes, they didn't have frosting on them. So I guess it's the quality of the ingredients that they used back then, but the cake never went bad. I say all of this for a reason. Stay with me. Well, my grandma was considering eating this big, beautiful piece of cake that this lady had given to her. My great grandma took the piece of cake and she put it in the cabinet and she forbid anyone to touch it. She felt in her spirit that something was wrong with this piece of cake, and she didn't want my grandma eating that cake. So they didn't think nothing about it for the rest of that day. So the next day, later on in the day, my grandma decided to eat the cake. So she went to the cabinet, she opened it up, and to her horror, that cake had turned green. There was poison in it. My great grandma told my grandma she didn't want her to eat that cake because she suspected it was poison. And she knew how to identify, she knew exactly what they were looking at. And she knew that the poison would reveal itself with time. That's why the lady wanted my grandma to eat that cake right away that evening. But sure enough, come to find out, the young lady who gave my grandma the cake was a rival who had wanted my grandpa for herself. Now, my great grandma told my grandma, don't eat any and everything that people give you. Be careful what you put in your mouth, because at that time, that was the number one way that people would hoodoo you. Now, I've heard stories of people being hoodooed through their stomach at church dinners. Growing up, my grandma and mama made sure all of us young folks knew not to eat and drink at everyone's house. If they caught you eating at someone's house that wasn't close family, they give you a whooping. That's how serious it was when I was a child. Hoodooing folks through their stomach is almost a lost art, and maybe that's for a good reason. This is the reason that I warn people all the time. This is not folk magic. Let me tell you, authentic hoodoo has a dark side that can be very dangerous. It's reflective of the dark times that our people had to endure in those days. Times were brutal, which often made some of our people hard, cold, and cutthroat. Here is how brutal it was. My uncle was pulled over by the police in Cullman, Alabama. This was probably in the late 60s. He was able to call and get word to my aunt, but she couldn't drive, so she called my dad. Now, he jumped in his car, he picked her up, and he swung by and got another one of our uncles, and they all raced to Coleman. My aunt said my dad had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth the whole time, clutching that steering wheel, because he was racing to get to Coleman before sundown. At sundown, the jailer would let you go, but you have to walk out of town. But as it got darker and you were walking out of town, some of the white men of the town would stop you. Sometimes they would beat you. People have been hung. Sometimes they would run you through the woods like they chasing a rabbit. And if you got away, you were able to live to see another day. But if you got caught, you were either beaten or sometimes killed, just like an animal. In that part of Alabama, hunting down black people after dark was a sport. Well, family, I hope you enjoyed this. Remember to be careful whose food you eat. Even on my job, through the years, we'd have potluck dinners and lunches and stuff. I wouldn't eat no food that people brought from home because I don't really know these people. Just be careful. So please support my work at my website. I have the 2024 Hoodoo Almanac, Soulful Divination, and Root Work for the Home books for sale. I also do spiritual consultations as well, if you didn't know. But I really want to thank you for subscribing and visiting my channel. Thanks to everyone who bought my books. I am so grateful to meet each of you who have requested a spiritual consultation. I have just been meeting some amazing people with amazing stories in their life. So until the next video, family, keep on building good and positive things in your life.